In this video, we're going to talk about dividing decimals. So let's start with this example. I'm going to say 7 56 divided by 8. So we've been working on our long division, so we know the steps to do this. Remember, dirty monkeys smell bad. I'm just going to write that up there to help me remember. And then I'm just going to start dividing like I normally do. I'm going to ignore this decimal for the time being, and then when we're finished, I'll show you where to put the decimal. So I'm first going to say, will 8 divide into 7? The answer to that is no. So we have been putting an X here to hold that spot. Now that we're dividing by decimals, I'm going to put a 0 there instead of an X. And that'll make sense in a little bit when we place our decimal. Okay, so now I'm going to say, will 8 divide into 75? And the answer is yes. It'll divide 9 times. So that was divide. Now I'm going to multiply. So I'm going to say 9 times 8 is 72. I'm going to put a little multiplication sign just to help me remember that I'm multiplying these two numbers. So 9 times 8 is 72. Then the S is subtract. And then the B means to bring down. Then I start all over again. Here's my new number. So I say, how many times will 8 divide into 36? And the answer is 4. Then I'm going to multiply. 4 times 8 is 32. And then I'm going to subtract. And I get 4. So at this point, normally you would say that this has a remainder of 4. But what's really cool with decimals is that we can keep dividing. So let's see what happens. We know that 7 56 can be expanded. I can put a 0 here and not change the value of this number. And what that allows me to do is have another number to bring down. So I can bring down that 0. So again, I added that 0 because we know we can add as many zeros as we want to without changing the value of the decimal. So by putting that 0 there, I now have a number that I can bring down so I can keep dividing. So let's see what happens now. 8 divides into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. When I subtract, I get 0. So that means I can stop dividing. I don't need to add any more zeros to bring down because I ended up with no remainder. Now we have to figure out, where do I put this decimal? And it's really very simple. You just put it straight up. So your quotient, your answer, is 945 thousandths. So the reason it's so important to line up your numbers correctly is so that when you put that decimal straight up, you're putting it in the right spot. Okay, so let's look at a different one. Let's look at when we want to change a fraction to a decimal. Now we talked about how 1/4, we can change that into a decimal by a special trick that I told you about, where we can multiply the numerator and the denominator to create an equivalent fraction where the denominator would be equal to 10, 100, or 1,000. And so in this case, 4 can be multiplied by 25, and that gives us a denominator of 100 with a numerator of 25. And I can now change that into a decimal, which would be 25 hundredths. So that works really well. That's a great trick when you have a denominator that you can multiply by something to get a denominator, an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 10, a multiple of 10, where you can change it into a decimal. But there's another way to do this too. Sometimes you don't have a denominator that you can multiply by something. So let's look, for example, at 4/9. There's nothing I can multiply by 9 that's going to give me a denominator of 10, 100, or 1,000. So we have to have a different strategy for fractions like this to be able to change this into a decimal. Because we know all fractions can be changed into a decimal, because a decimal is just a different way of writing a fraction. And all fractions, I'll say that again, can be changed into a decimal. So if the first strategy doesn't work of finding an equivalent fraction, then you can use this strategy. So I'm going to erase this that we have over here to give myself a little more room. And we're going to look at this one. So we know that 4/9, we learned earlier in the year that that means 4 divided by 9. So let's set that up. 4 divided by 9. So up until now, you would look at that and you'd say, oh, 9 will not divide into 4, so we can't do that. But what you have in your toolbox now is you know about decimals. So 4 is the same thing as 4 decimal 0. Because remember, at the end of a number, if we put a decimal here, anything after the decimal, we can add zeros to the end as much as we want. So now I can divide this. So let's see what happens. We know 9 will not divide into 4. So I'm going to put a 0 right there to hold that place. Now I'm going to say, how many times will 9 divide into 40? And 9 will divide into 40 4 times. So notice that I'm ignoring the decimal for right now. I'm just pretending that it's not there. We'll place the decimal at the end. Okay, so 4 times, and then I'm going to say 4 times 9 is 36. Then I'm going to subtract. When I subtract, I get 4. Okay, so you might be tempted to have a remainder, but remember with decimals, we no longer have to have a remainder because we can keep dividing until we get to a full decimal. So remember what we said, we can add another 0. Remember, I can add as many zeros as I like. All right. So I'm going to say 9 divides into 40 4 times. 4 times 9 is 36. And I'm going to subtract and get 4. Are you noticing anything? All right, I'm still not done, so I'm going to add another 0. I'm going to bring that down. What are you noticing? All right, 9 divides into 4. 4 times 9 is 36. Oh my goodness, I got a 4 again. All right. Let's place our decimal first. Remember, our decimal, we just go straight up, put our decimal right there. So this is a special kind of fraction that creates what we call a repeating decimal. And we can do this forever and ever and ever. And the same pattern will just keep happening and happening and happening. So we'll have 4s on into infinity. So the way we handle that is we use our rounding skills. We do one of two things. Sometimes we write this quotient right here. This is our answer or our quotient. We can write it like this with a line over it. That line over it tells us that it's a repeating decimal and that the 4 goes on and on and on forever. We can also round. So let's say we wanted to round to the nearest 100. So I would look to the number beside it, which is a 4, and that 4 tells this 4 to stay the same because it's less than 5. So I could also round my answer to 44 hundredths. And when you're doing your work, it will tell you what to do. It'll say round to the nearest tenth or round to the nearest hundredth. It will give you instructions on what to do when you have a decimal like this. And there's all types of repeating decimals. Sometimes decimals repeat in a pattern, like you might have 1, 2, 3, and then another 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. So lots of different possibilities, but they are called repeating decimals.